Everyone. Thank you for joining. This is the fourth installment of this webinar series called DDF Solution Showcase. My name is Govind Subramanian. I'm part of the TransCelerate Digital Data Flow team, and I will be your moderator today. Next. So this is our agenda for the webinar today. Our two feature presentations are from CRScube and studyOS, lasting about 30 minutes each, followed by a panel discussion with all of our panelists today. But prior to that, we'll go over some webinar logistics, some ground rules, and also some updates that we want to share with you. Next. So a little bit about our panelists. We have Sylvain Berthelot and Robert Hay from CRScube, who will be our first set of presenters. And we have Ellis Hiroki Butterfield from studyOS, who will be our second presenter. We will also have Julie Smiley from CDISC, who will join the panel discussion in the very end. Next. So just a few logistical points about the webinar. All participants will be muted during the call. You can access the audio through your computer or a phone. As far as questions, we've received some questions already from participants through the registration process. We will be addressing some of those questions in the beginning of the panel discussion. Towards the end of the webinar, but if time permits, we'll take live questions that we receive during the webinar. So if you have a question you want to submit, you can do that at any time during the webinar by clicking the icon with the question mark in the upper right hand corner of your window. Next. So some ground rules. We will not be going through each one, but just to highlight a few, we will not be able to address questions regarding solutions that are not featured in today's webinar. We will also not be able to address which organization is using which solution, anything to do with pricing or cost and those aspects. Next. So a bit about TransCelerate's mission. TransCelerate is a not-for-profit entity created to foster collaboration across the global biopharmaceutical community, primarily to drive the efficient, effective, and high-quality delivery of new medicines. Next. So a bit of a background about this webinar series. We started doing this in fall of 2024. We've already had 3 webinars. Today is the 4th one. This is co-hosted and co-sponsored by both TransCelerate and CDISC. TransCelerate is leading the DDF initiative, and CDISC is leading the development of the USDM standard. What we have been able to do is, by hosting these webinars, we've been able to bring together industry stakeholders to showcase how DDF and USDM are being implemented. Next. So I would like to invite Julie Smiley from CDISC to say a few words about CDISC's mission and also speak about a recent release that CDISC has had. So I'll pass it on to Julie now.
Great, thanks, Govind. So good morning, everyone. So again, just going to give a quick update on CDISC and kind of some resources that are available to you around the USDM. So CDISC, develops open consensus-based data standards. We're also a nonprofit organization, like Govind mentioned about TransCelerate. And these standards that we develop are freely available, and they're used around the world to improve consistency and efficiency in clinical research. And we really support a global network through education, partnerships, different events, and data science initiatives to ensure broad adoption and impact. Today, our standards are downloaded in over 90 countries and play a key role in enabling high-quality, interoperable research that benefits global health. Next slide, please. Thank you. In terms of TransCelerate's digital data flow initiative, the USDM version 4.0 was just recently released, and some of the highlights are that it is aligned with ICH M11. We have support for complex studies, interventional and observational studies, and medical devices. And content reuse has really been maximized, as well as support for multiple document templates. And finally, also the model is now extensible to provide greater flexibility for different organizations who adopt this. Next slide, please. In terms of resources available, you can use this QR code or the URL on the right, and this will take you to the CDISC DDF webpage, and you can find out more information. You can download the USDM 4.0 standards, and it will also take you to the GitHub repository, or you can use the link at the bottom of this page to be able to get to the GitHub repository with all of the resources available for DDF and the USDM, the data model. Again, that's Unified Study Definitions Model. Next slide. And then also in terms of being able to learn more, there are multiple training options, and you can enroll in one of the CDISC authorized courses to understand more about the USDM. And as you may have seen, if you're on the CDISC subscription list, we just announced this week, there's also now an offering for a USDM onboarding package. And this is a private training package designed specifically for your organization's needs. So there would be kind of a meeting with your organization, trying to understand your needs, and then the training will be tailored to your organization's specific needs. And then you can also use the QR code here on this slide to get access to these training courses. And then I will hand it back over to you, Govind. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Julie, for sharing all of that information. So we just want to share or make an announcement about an exciting upcoming event. So this is the annual DDF Digital Data Flow in-person event that is going to happen across 2 days and 2 locations, September 24th and 25th at New Jersey, US, and Basel, Switzerland. You can register and attend in person. We will post the registration link in the chat right now that you can access, so you can click in and register through that. There is no fee to attend this event. If you are a solution provider, you have the opportunity to present a poster during this event at either one or both locations. If you're interested in presenting a poster and want to learn how to submit a poster for our review, please send us an email at the email ID that you see on screen at the bottom of the screen, ddf@transceratebioPharmainc.com. No, you don't have to type that all out. We will post that email in the chat as well now, and you can just cut and paste. So if you're interested in registering for the event or submitting a poster, you can follow those links. Next. So we've concluded sort of the introductory part of this webinar, and we're moving into our main presentations. The first presenting organization will be CRScube, and I would like to now invite Sylvain Berthelot and Robert Hay to begin their presentation.
Thank you, Govind, and hi everyone. So I'm just about to share my screen. It's my pleasure to share with you how we are embracing the USDM standards at CRScube with the goal to accelerate e-clinical technology setup in the near future. And I'd like also to take this opportunity to thank TransCelerate and CDISC for such useful platforms to share between or within the industry. So I'm Sylvain Berthelot. I'm the VP of Strategy and Marketing at CRScube. I've been in the industry for over 20 years, 15 of which in clinical trials, mainly on the clinical vendor side. And my goal is to make clinical trials more accessible, which, as you can imagine, is a never-ending task. And I also have my own patient advocacy podcast called On One Condition. Robert?
Thanks, Sylvain. Hello, everyone. My name is Robert Hay. I'm a marketing and solutions consultant at CRScube, and I've been working in the industry and pharma as well since 2019. And I believe that we need to leverage AI and automation in order to accelerate the access of new treatments to patients. Thank you.
So what are we going to cover over the next 20 or nearly 30 minutes? We will do a short company introduction about CRScube, then focus on what our goals are with implementing DDF and the USDM, including development to date. So what have we done so far? We'll have a short demo of what it looks like and what we're aiming to do in the future, aligning with what's going on currently on the USDM standards and guidelines. So CRScube, we were established in 2011, and we originated in Korea. And so far, we've built over 5,800 trials. A lot of you may not know us. We're very well implanted in Asia. We're number one in clinical vendor in Korea. We believe we're around number 3 in Japan. And the reason I'm sharing this is not for promotion or anything, but to put it into context, and I'm going to talk more about that in a moment. Despite our position, we have very little requests or acknowledgement of the work we do on the leveraging the USDM standards in Asia. So I'm going to talk more about that in a sec. Our mission at CRScube is to make clinical trials more accessible, which aligns nicely with my personal mission. I've put our tagline here, clinical data simply. Why have I put that? Because I'm sure a lot of you will agree with me that it's actually not that simple. It should be simpler. And that's why we really welcome the effort from both TransCelerate and CDISC to make standardization across the industry real, and to also enable knowledge sharing between vendors, sponsors, and so on. As I alluded to, from our point of view, we think we could benefit from better awareness, especially in Asia. And I'll explain why it's important for us specifically in a moment. So, standardization. When I started thinking about this webinar today, I thought, where are we, or what have we done so far in terms of standardization? So, I think there's 2 steps, and the first one, which I call homemade, I'm sure a lot of you will think, well, no, that's not standardization. It's mainly what we've done at our end, and I'm sure other vendors do the same, where we have tools like pre-validated libraries, or even build your own libraries, study-to-study copy, which help our users standardize across their studies. But it's not real standardization because it's limited to a specific sponsor or a specific CRO. But then we have what I call Homemade Plus, where we have what we've done at our end, plus very interesting standards that are across the industry, like CDISC and SDTM. And we love at our end leveraging those standards, and that's why we're in the process of developing a new solution called Cube DDF, which is our way of leveraging the USDM. We're also eagerly waiting for the release of the ICH M11 guidelines in the fall, because it aligns very nicely with the USDM, and at our end we believe that it's going to help increase the awareness and also the demand for those standard functionalities. From our point of view, considering our position in Asia, we have a bit of a challenge because our clients are not necessarily aware of the DDF and USDM initiatives, and especially of its benefits. So for us, it means that our clients are not necessarily talking about it, they're not necessarily asking for it, and we don't really have much of a proof that their neighbors are trying to also implement something like this, unfortunately. So we do believe that the USDM is part of the future of enabling faster study setup, from our point of view at least, and we're investing in it. However, that puts us in a position where we're investing in something without having the guarantee that our clients are going to ask for it. So it could reduce our ability to, in the future, provide such innovative solutions if we don't do, if we're not more vocal in a way in Asia. And we are vocal at our end, but we could also do with more, I think, partners or other entities being as vocal as we are. So what are we aiming to do with implementing DDF and the USDM? Before we go into the details, I want to give you a quick introduction about our platform. So we have a unique platform that includes all the solutions you see on screen here. So going from data capture with EDC, RTSM, eSource, and ePro, patient inclusion with eConsent, and then some trial management tools, so CTMS, TMF, RBQM, learning management system, and Cube safety for pharmacovigilance. Now, when we think about what we're doing with Cube DDF and leveraging the USDM standards, we're going to impact those of our solutions. Why those ones? Because they are focused on data capture, clinical data capture. The content or the configuration of those solutions is defined from the protocol, not fully, but a lot of what we configure in an EDC, in RTSM, ePro, and so on, comes from the protocol. And for us, it makes sense to look at those solutions as a whole because they all share the same data structure and they all share the same configuration tool, Cube Builder. So I think it's important for you to have this in mind when you listen to Rob, because he's going to put that into context, sharing what we've done so far and how it works. So over to you, Rob.
Thank you, Sylvain. Yeah, so to go off what Sylvain was saying, here we're talking about the core objectives behind our development of QDDF, but more importantly, it reflects why we've chosen to pursue this direction. At the highest level, our aim is to prepare for a future where protocol digitalization is the standard, and the QDDF initiative and USDM specifications point in that direction. And while adoption is still in its early stages, we see this as a necessary evolution. First, it's about reducing effort. By building studies from structured machine-readable protocols, we can automate much of the configuration and validation process that is currently manual and very time-consuming. And that would free up human effort for areas where judgment is still essential, for example, edit checks or managing components that are fully captured by the protocol, such as logistics or supply chain management. We also expect to apply this same logic to STTM conversion, gradually reducing the manual mapping. And second, it's also about increasing quality. Using a digital protocol as the starting point means less room for misinterpretation and fewer manual errors in the setup. Protocol amendments, for example, could be handled systematically, and because QDDF operates as a separate module, it doesn't interfere with our existing systems, so it integrates alongside them, minimizing any disruption. And third, it's also about future readiness. As the DDF initiative evolves and initiatives like the ICH M11 and Cosmos mature, we at CRScube want to be ready. So QDDF gives us a platform that can adapt, whether that means supporting future standards, enabling integrations, or responding quickly when broader adoption catches up. So while this project wasn't driven by client demand, for us it's a strategic investment in where we believe the industry is going, and we'd rather be building early than waiting up to catch up later. So we are aware that there are third-party providers who are working on digitizing the protocol, but we've made the conscious decision to not participate in that ourselves so that we can focus on the tools that we're developing, to not delay those being released and providing something that is beneficial to our clients. So we've started implementing the first use case, which is study configuration. So far, we've developed the transformation step within QDDF, beginning with the JSON file. The system allows batch uploads of multiple JSON files at once, along with Excel format for flexibility during early adoption. The next steps in this workflow will include automated design generation within KubeBuilder, which will allow for seamless deployment with the previously mentioned CRScube solutions with minimal manual setup. The second use case is EDC to STTM conversion, and this would follow a similar transformation logic. Here, data captured within kubecdms, which is our EDC platform, would be imported into QDDF, then converted into a structured STTM JSON export. Not necessarily using USDM, but we thought it was interesting to share how this is aligning fully with the DDF initiative. So now we're going to go over a brief demonstration of the latest product release of QDDF and how it uses the USDM specifications. So once we've logged in here, we can upload a protocol definition file in JSON format, and this structure follows the USDM specifications published by CDISC. So QDDF also supports Excel format, which is helpful during earlier phases when structured files may not yet be finalized. Both single and multiple files can be uploaded depending on how the study data is managed. So after the file is uploaded, QDDF validates the structure and transforms the content into a format suitable for reviewer interaction, and this process checks that the file meets the expected schema and prepares it for display. So once transformed, the file is available for inspection in a structured table view. So each row here corresponds to a distinct protocol item, such as visit, activity, or an identifier. And users can edit these fields directly or insert new rows if minor changes are needed. So this allows teams to make adjustments without having to reprocess the original source file, which can save time when responding to feedback or incorporating late changes. So there we can see the edits being made. and then rows being added to the solution with direct text input into those fields. So QDDF automatically tracks document level changes. So every time a change is made, whether through upload or manual edit, a new version is created and logged. So here we can see the study version 2 and also the creation of another version as well, a manual version here for 2.1. So this version contains the structured protocol content from the uploaded file. That's version 2, and it's now isolated as a version snapshot. We've incorporated the ability to create manual versions, and what we're seeing here is a breakdown of the key protocol components as defined in that version, such as study identifier and other metadata fields. At this point, we can see a new study identifier being added manually, and this allows for additional tracking or labeling within the study setup and demonstrates how QDDF supports incremental updates within a given version. Each version preserves a complete view of the protocol at a specific point in time, which is useful for managing amendments or comparing configurations across iterations. So there we can see the reference identifiers. And here we have a list of the eligibility criteria within the JSON file that's been uploaded. And so within the study info tab, which is coming up momentarily, so here we can see study metadata such as the title, phase, sponsor, and therapeutic area. And these fields are editable directly within QDDF. For example, here we can see that therapeutic area is being updated, and this is done with a controlled list, and this helps maintain consistency while aligning with CDISC terminology or reporting standards. While currently read-only, future updates will allow protocol designers to propose changes to the design directly within this view, including adding or removing visits or reassigning activities. So next here we have our section about the biomedical concepts. These have not been fully implemented yet, and I will explain the reasoning for this in later slides. And now we're going to move on to the scheduling of activities. So you'll see the study epochs, and then moving on to the scheduling of activities. So this defines the timing conditions under which the study activities occur. This is more of a detailed section of the protocol and is already fully editable within QDDF. Users can make direct changes to visit schedules, plan activities, and their associated metadata without needing to leave the platform or modify that original JSON file externally. So once that's been saved, now we're moving on to exporting the file. We've clicked the USDM export file there, and here we can see the fully compliant JSON file output, and this can be shared with other systems. In this interface, we can see that the exported file also has the version tag and metadata for traceability. And that concludes the demo of QDDF. Okay, so here we're talking about the summary of the progress that we've made and some of the key challenges that we've encountered during the development and implementation of the USDM-based study configuration workflow. On the implementation side, we developed a file uploader that supports both JSON and Excel formats and converted them into a USDM-compatible structure. The QDDF interface allows users to visualize and interact with that content, and we've also built in version control to support protocol iterations over time. In terms of challenges, one area has been interpreting the evolving details of the USDM and the broader DDF initiative. It's a relatively new standard, and aligning our development with both the intent and the implementation nuances have required closer analysis. Another significant challenge involves biomedical concepts. So these are a key part of CDISC's vision for structured protocols. These are now being formalized under the Cosmos project and CDISC's effort to standardize the way clinical concepts are defined and linked across domains. However, implementing these biomedical concepts requires mapping them directly to our CRS structures, which is currently a separate and complex process. For now, biomedical concepts are not yet implemented within CubeDDF, but our next step will be to incorporate the Cosmos schema into our platform, so we can begin supporting this structure natively and eventually automate concept-driven study setup. So here we're talking about the outline of requirements for our second use case, which would be about converting data from EDC into an SDTM compliant JSON file. So the flow begins with data captured within CubeCDMS, which is our EDC, which will then be imported into CubeDDF for transformation, ultimately producing an SDTM format JSON export. To enable this, we'll need to implement several key components: data replication from CubeCDMS, version control for managing data iterations, and the actual EDC to SDTM conversion logic and support for exporting the result into the JSON format. However, there is a dependency. Until the study configuration use case, the first one that we talked about, is fully implemented and stable, we're not able to proceed with this conversion workflow. That foundation is essential before we start aligning raw EDC data into the SDTM format.
Thank you, Rob. So I am back. So I'm just going to share briefly what we expect we have left to do and to conclude our presentation today. So you've seen what we've done so far. The demo that you saw is a version of our product which is fully workable. However, as Rob explained, we need to implement the USDM 4.0, which have been released recently. And we also want to align with the release of the ICH M11 guidelines. The reason why biomedical concepts are important for us and why we've mentioned them a few times is that up to the release of version 4.0, we weren't sure about how they would match our ECRS structure. So for us, it's we've done so much, or as much as we could do so far, and now it's the next step. So align with USDM 4.0, ICH M11 guidelines, then implement the biomedical concepts in CubeDDF, which will match our ECRF structure. And that will then allow us to build the link to our configuration tool, Cube Builder. And then from that configuration tool, that means that it will automatically do the configuration of our EDC and potentially other of our solutions in the future. So there's still work to do, but I think what we've done so far is quite interesting already and a good foundation. Outside of what we need to do technically on the platform, we are also very conscious that we want to increase awareness. So as I said to begin with, we are very vocal about what we do with CubeDDF and aligning with USDM standards. We promote the benefits that our users are going to get from it. But we're also looking for other ways and potentially partners to help us increase awareness, because we really believe that the more people implement those standards, the better it's going to be for our industry, because it will help reduce timelines, increase quality, and so on, everything that Rob mentioned. And we don't want people to miss out on those benefits, really. So I believe at the moment, when I look at the market in Asia, we're in a stage of ignorance or lack of awareness. So I want us to move to a point where people are aware of it, and awareness will naturally lead to demand, because the benefits are so great. And with that, it concludes our part of this webinar today. If you're interested in what we've presented and you want to talk to us directly, please do. You have my email address on screen here. If you want to learn more, we're always happy to share knowledge on what we're doing. So anyone who wants to get in touch, please do so. Thank you.
Thank you, Sylvain and Robert, for a very insightful presentation. Um, the demo that you showed, as well as uh, how you described your solution under those specific use cases, was really helpful. So thank you very much. In the interest of time, we will quickly move on to our second presentation from studyOS. I would like to now invite Ellis Hiroki Butterfield to begin his presentation.
All right, can you hear me? Okay. Hey everyone,
Yes.
my name is Ellis Hiroki, founder and CEO of studyOS. In today's talk, I'd like to share with you how USDM powers a significant portion of our clinical trial assistant technology. And the goal of my talk is to help you understand why digital protocol representations are so critical, like USDM, and for certain AI applications, and why you don't need necessarily wholesale adoption to find meaningful use. I am a fast talker. There are a lot of slides and it's a little bit technical. So if you get lost at any point in time, please feel free to reach out afterwards and I'm happy to answer any questions. So most discussions about USDM are within the context of protocol design. However, in this talk, I'll be discussing how digital protocol representations like USDM are necessary for several Gen AI scenarios. And this presentation is in the context of our experience. So first I'll do a little bit of background on the problem that we solve, kind of how naive approaches that don't actually solve the problem, where USDM comes into play and why it's so critical, and finally the gaps to adoption. So first off, just a little bit of what we do. So meet Ash. So Ash is our kind of clinical trial agent. It's the what we're calling the first ever AI assistant for scaling study teams. Our mission is to enable leaner clinical teams through agentic automation and collaboration with experienced human operators. And we're doing that through our agentic assistant named Ash. And you might hear Ash and think of this guy from the famous Alien movie franchise, which this has been pointed out to me by several people, and no, it's not him, but actually Ashish Vaswani, the lead author of Attention Is All You Need, the seminal paper that actually introduced the transformer architecture, ushering in the kind of LLM paradigm as we know it today. Most people probably don't know that, but for all of the different products on market that are kind of AI or AI adjacent, you could thank this guy for that. Anyway, I digress. So a little bit about Ash and how it powers studyOS. So studyOS is our kind of overall data platform. It ingests from a variety of sources, from clinical data, operational data, and documents, and so on. And on the other end, it produces things like risk and signal detection, real-time monitoring, and AI-assisted exploratory analysis and data review. So we'll talk about one of those use cases today in particular, kind of data interrogation. It's something that a lot of people really wish that they had better access to, and it's something that we'll kind of talk about how USD empowers that. And while our ambition is to use agentic AI to power kind of automation across a variety of use cases, which you may have heard about in other talks, we've explored a lot of different situations internally that involve USDM, like CRF builds and so on. Our current focus is primarily centered around these three use cases, which is to say, how do we kind of narrow the gap between the user intent, which is they have a question about their study, they want to interrogate their data, and the outcome, which is the actual answers. So for today, as I mentioned, we'll talk about one of these use cases, which is data interrogation. So today, if you were to ask a question like this, you might spend quite a lot of time trying to answer this. I know that audit trail analytics is actually a pretty common use case for us right now. And so if you were to ask, which sites have changed the IE fields the most normalized on patients, to get the answer out can take a lot of effort today, unless it's a report that you've already pre-programmed or it's custom. It takes, a clinical programmer or someone with pretty sophisticated technical knowledge to produce this result for you. And we're going to talk about how USDM provides this critical protocol backbone to ASH, enabling us to answer these questions in a mere number of seconds, as opposed to the days or weeks it might take for you to get answers to these kinds of critical insights today. So there are quite a few roadblocks to narrowing this gap, as discussed, from like when a user has an intent to the outcome that they want. But to name a few, when it comes to getting answers to study questions or setting these controls, we more or less have, two methods, right? The first is we deem it important enough to commit dedicated resources to it, and we go the programming route, right? And that requires individuals with internal expertise. It requires infrastructure that has to be set up, which in and of itself is a challenge. You have to coordinate between the business users and the technical implementers. It requires upfront time. But once you have it, it is, scalable by definition. That's like what a dashboard is, right? But the number of things that we have to ask about in our studies versus the amount of time and resources we have is the disparity is quite large. So what ends up happening most often, and what clinical operations folks are left to deal with, is manual data extraction, which is pivot tables and the like. And regardless of which method is chosen, the reality is, as we learn more about the study from kind of the very beginning to as we're going on through it, there's always new things we learn. There are always new information, like new intents, like new interrogations that you want to have, whether inquiry or control. So for example, if you have a new rule about the study, you believe that there's a threshold. So for instance, if you're thinking about R3 and you have an acceptable range, how do you implement that quickly without having to kind of go through this whole cycle, this very expensive cycle? And so the problem is, it's very difficult today to adapt new learnings and reduce this time from inquiry or intent to outcome, as discussed before. So this is really the problem that we're faced with, and this is the problem that we're trying to solve. So in an ideal world, we'd like to have study members, in any of these number of questions, kind of be able to be answered in a timely fashion. Just a moment here. And so it begets the question, how can we effectively allow users to interrogate data and set controls? And so this is, applicable across a lot of domains, this general problem of kind of having a question. And on the right here, we have like a little bit of a demo of how ASH works today. So with a natural language, it converts the question into something that is both reproducible and visual. So in this case, I don't know how many people in the audience may have experienced use with any kind of Gen AI applications today, but one of the most common things you'll hear about is hallucination. For folks who aren't aware of what that is, a hallucination is basically when Gen AI makes up information. And so that's an utterly and critically absolutely not okay thing in this industry. And so you should never let them actually answer questions for you. What you should do is let them create the underlying code, such as SAS or SQL or anything else that is reproducible, validatable, auditable, and so on. And so that's really the backbone of what we do. So a lot of what we're going to be talking about is, if you were to build this yourself, right, or if you have internal teams investigating solutions in this manner, how would you do this? How would you solve this today? And so the problem with these kinds of solutions is that clinical trials present a unique analytics challenge. So it's not to say that the problem of NLP analytics isn't well understood. It's actually a pretty well researched area. However, a lot of these general purpose solutions that you might see on market, especially with larger database vendors, are ineffective at answering questions for clinical trials. There's a lot of data that's very significant. to clinical trials, which is just completely absent in other domains. And then finally, these products are mostly built for marketing and sales. So a lot of the models have been trained to do things like roll-ups and aggregations on transactional data. However, within clinical trials, we have very unique components. We have subgroups, we have subperiods, we have study-specific definitions, we have branching conditional logic. We have a lot of things that are textual, which are non-numerical, I should say. And so on the analysis side, you have a lot of that. It's also temporal, based on the study schedule rather than calendar days. And finally, there's a lot of showing your work, so that when you're looking back, you can say, this is what the data looked like at this time. This is how I came to my answer. And you can show that to inspectors or anyone else who's looking. And so what you can see is you need something quite a bit more bespoke to this industry than you might find in other products. And I think where we come into USDM is that if you notice, a lot of questions and how you answer a question has a lot to do with what's contained within the protocol. And so the question is, how do you get protocol specific context within the overall answering engine? So as I mentioned before, how do we provide relevant protocol data to the model accurately so that you can trust your outputs? So if we're going back to the original question I posed earlier, which site has the most changes to primary endpoint data after baseline? Primary endpoint data and baseline are things that are both typically defined within a protocol. And so unless you're hard coding that information in, which would by definition make it not scalable, you knew a way to inject this. And so GenAI is really good at predicting what a user wants from a given user prompt, but this can result in kind of the hallucinatory problem I mentioned earlier. So this means that you can't just upload data straight into it and be sure that it's correct. So in order to create a solution that is, accurate and to solve something as critical and as important as answering study questions, you can't rely on GenAI alone. And so without the protocol context, many of the questions themselves, prompts are unanswerable. So, if you don't have the protocol within your general kind of Q&A framework, you won't even be able to produce responses that are accurate. So context is everything. And in this specific case, when I say context, I mean one, context that you're providing this information, but also two, context within the kind of AI vernacular, which represents the information that is being provided at a given time to the processing engine. So if you were to build this yourself, a naive solution might be to infer from the EDC or similar data structures information about the protocol. The problem is that EDCs capture an increasingly smaller percentage of total study data. So if you're relying on implicit information captured from the structure of the data itself, you're going to miss a lot of critical information necessary to answer a huge portion of questions. The second thing is that event data only contains information enough to fulfill statistical analysis needs, and rarely does it include a lot of critical information that you might find within the protocol itself, which is going to be relevant to the questions being asked, but not necessarily something that's necessarily captured by the data itself. And lastly, structures are different per study. They're not scalable. And I think this is basically touched on by almost every person who talks about USDM, which is the entirety of, which answers the entire question of how do we make these processes more scalable. The second naive solution you might consider when building a solution like this is to embed protocol directly into the context window. So again, the context window is basically the amount of information that you pass to an LLM during runtime. The problem is that, and this is true of anyone who's ever interacted with a protocol, information is scattered literally everywhere, and so it's not necessarily feasible to just assume that just because it's not enough to assume locality of information. Finally, providing raw information as far as like large scale PDFs and other textual documents can lead to hallucinations and other problems. I think the other big problem with this one is it's really not reproducible. It's very difficult to show that if you provide a super large PDF, exactly where in the context, where in that context is the information being derived. And it's also expensive. I wouldn't recommend this approach regardless, just because the token usage amount would be very high, and then the basis of your solution would no longer be worthwhile. I know some folks have probably heard about retrieval augmented generation, or RAG. So this is a really common term. Retrieval augmented generation is basically the concept of taking large amounts of information, turning them into essentially embedding vectors, which are ways to represent information in multidimensional space, so that you can find things that are represented similarly in this kind of multidimensional way. The problem with this is that protocol documents do not share the same layout. So you can do this, but you're likely to accidentally chunk incorrectly. And once I say chunk, it's if you take the document, you're splitting into all these little pieces, and then you're trying to make those into multidimensional vectors. Pertinent information that might be relevant to one another are not necessarily going to be found because they were chunked incorrectly. And another challenge with this specific approach is that knowing how many top K results to include for a given question is difficult when you're using a completely unbounded and unstructured RAG implementation. And then lastly, and this is just generally true of protocols and processing protocols in any way, is that it's largely incompatible with tables, which means that your entire schedule of assessments information would not be necessarily neatly included in this, and you'd have to probably do some kind of manual post-processing for this specifically. Oh no. All right, so what do you need to actually solve this problem well? And so this is kind of the meat and potatoes of this. So I encourage that anyone who's considering these kinds of internal implementations to just skip all of those painful headaches that I mentioned earlier and just go straight to USDM. And why? Because one, it's reproducible. Well, what you need to actually have a good solution here is that you need to have it reproducible and deterministic, right? So if you're looking for a specific information about a protocol, you want to be sure that every single time that you look for that information, it's in the exact same place, and then you can actually use some kind of codified methodology to get access to that information. It's auditable. You can actually have a code path that goes there. The second thing is it needs to be scalable, which means you don't want to repeat yourself. The more times you have to repeat yourself in any part of clinical development, as we know, you're prone to error, you're prone to transcriptional issues, and so on and so forth. So you want to avoid that. And finally, it's extremely context rich. So one of the more interesting things about USDM is that not only does it combine structured information, such as the kind of biomedical concept has been discussed before, but the actual schedule of assessments, but it also includes things like narrative elements, which gives you the actual textual write-up of the protocol, as opposed to just the structured document itself, which can not always contain all the information that you need. So firstly, reproducible. Protocol as data allows the same code to produce the same results as mentioned before. And you can use narrative elements directly as embeddings rather than arbitrary text chunks. So this is actually really great. The narrative embeddings methodology makes sure that you're kind of ensuring that the context, or like rather the embedding itself, contains the full information that you need. So while embeddings do tend to have limits, at least in this specific way, you know that the boundary of your embedding is going to be very representative of what you need. It's scalable. It's a consistent interface. It unlocks downstream automation, right? Once use many, as CRScube and other presenters have shown before. If you can create these kinds of structures up front, you can have a lot of downstream automation just based on the fact that everyone can agree on the same interface. This is, largely the benefit of DDS to begin with, and I would encourage everyone who's investigating this to consider the broader picture when they think about this, and not necessarily just one-off implementations or things like protocol development and so on. Secondly, it's part of a larger industry standardization effort, which is to say that if you are going to implement now, you have the benefit of doing something which many other organizations are going to eventually conform to. And so then your work will eventually be additive or accrue to more scenarios later on. And it finally covers a lot of scenarios. I think this is probably a little bit underappreciated, is that it's quite robust, because even though not every element is structured, the narrative elements itself allows for you to use non-structured information as well, even if you can't use the structured pieces. And finally, context rich. So one of the things that's really interesting about the USDM standard as well is that it relates pieces of content to one another, and things like biomedical concepts allow for very, very granular standardization in association with data. And finally, again, the semi-structured narrative. So how do we do it internally? So first, we use Ash to bootstrap the USDM format from the protocol PDF. So right now we don't get the USDM DDF sent to us. That would be great, But as many folks who are either in the clinical or kind of the CRO space would understand, this is not how you get information today. And so unfortunately, there is this step of how do we get to DDF first? Second, we will generate the reference tables and kind of our internal protocol API, which is to say, like, how do we actually set up the DDF? Reference tables internally are needed because actually, I'll touch on that a little bit later, but in many cases, you still want to have tabular representation. But the nice thing is once you have the structured representation given to you by DDF, you can then easily generate the tables as a result. And then finally, provide protocol context to Ash during query generation. So an agentic flow simplified. And for those who are listening and considering building these internally to their organization, I'm happy to chat about the kind of pitfalls and so on associated with just the flow development. But at the very highest level, you're going to need to develop something like a planner. So the planner is going to decide what the user is asking. It needs to clarify questions. It needs to enrich the information. For example, it needs to enrich it based off of whether or not there are acronyms being used and so on. The query development agent is the thing that actually turns the prompts into the structured codified programming language. So whether or not that is a downstream Python or SAS or SQL, that's what the query development agent would be used for. Finally, the summarizer agent and the chart generation agent are separate from that. One summarizes the content itself and the other one summarizes or generates the charts. And so you kind of want to separate all of these components together effectively if you want to develop a solution like this. I know that a lot of what we're trying to go for in the industry as it relates to kind of data management is to evolve our teams from kind of the more conventional manual review to more sophisticated analysis. And this is one of the good steps you can take to moving from folks who may not necessarily have the programming language technical skills, but do understand the domain and how you can kind of go from more natural language to a more structured representation of what they're trying to do in a more scalable way. And it's within this query development agent that USDM becomes absolutely critical. So from this, we have the protocol tool, and that pulls in the relevant content from USDM, and the data catalog tool, which finally identifies the relevant tables and columns and any other information that's necessary to answer a user's query at runtime. And in a super simplified manner, I'm just going to kind of gloss through this a little bit. With something like a term called primary endpoint, because of the definitions that exist within the USDM standard today, you can actually generate code that directly pulls in the relevant data at runtime. This is key because you can show exactly where you're getting this information, both for debuggability as well as user information. And then for something like baseline, you can use this, you can use an embedding model, which is basically, again, to say, how do you turn this into a vector representation so that you can find this information easily. And you can get the output from the USDM as well, which is typically going to be contained within the narrative elements. So USDM use at studyOS. We didn't do the full adoption of USDM in the sense that not everything is covered internally. We did not need every single component. So what we didn't do, we didn't internally handle amendment and version handling. It's something we'd like to do. I know that it's contained there, but it's not necessary for us at this moment. And currently, we skipped kind of non-essential areas, and we only used it for context and not for downstream systems, which I think that is just more representative of what we're doing internally, as our product is very, very specifically based on data interrogation and setting up controls for risks in studies. However, I think a huge amount of value of USDM as a standard is, or USDM DDF as a standard, is its ability to be used by downstream system. And I guarantee that we would one day be a consumer of such standards in the future. And not to mention that we may eventually use it for downstream systems ourselves if we end up developing further products down the line. If anyone's ever tried to use the protocol as is to develop, well, actually that's the industry standard, then you'll realize how expensive that is in terms of man hours, in terms of technical team work. And so it becomes kind of an obvious adoption methodology. And yet, despite doing none of the things I mentioned just a second ago, we were still able to create ASH itself, which is a reproducible, accurate, validatable, and auditable clinical trial agent. We were also able to automatically generate a huge swath of the reference tables that are needed at runtime. which is absolutely critical because reference tables are much faster to reference than using some kind of using the actual protocol tool lookup at runtime. And finally, it reduced our implementation processes and timelines. So this is something that would be relevant to anyone who's considering an adoption of such a standard, is that once you go into having a structured protocol representation internally, you'll find that your technical teams can then start building and layering on top of the structured representation, and then everything becomes a lot smoother afterwards. The initial challenge of conversion is, of course, a little bit bumpy at the beginning, but I will say that every single team is already doing some amount of this conversion when you're using these documented versions of protocols anyway, and so it's not nearly as much of a process change as you might think. And so I would encourage you to consider this as a process, regardless of its differences between what you're doing now and what you're doing in the future. So some challenges with DDF and adoption today, or at least internally. It's not widely adopted. I think this has been discussed by other folks as well. It's one of those things where we all have to make the very proactive decision to do it ahead of time because it will happen, but we still can't rely on it as being the common interface, which I think is the big challenge that we're going to have. At some point in time, though, once DDF becomes as ubiquitous as we believe, as we believe it will become, then the clinical technology vendors that you're working with can start using it as a input to their processes, which will therefore make their processes faster and cheaper as well. And you can also provide this information to all of your other relevant study team members, vendors, etc. Bootstrapping PDFs to USDM format is non-trivial. So unfortunately, we have to do that today. It's a cost that we're willing to bear, and many folks are, but it's not simple. And it's not an obviously adoptable standard in the sense that, as I mentioned, we didn't do some of these different areas, like for example, the versioning and so on. There's not a lot of documentation that exists today to say like, okay, you haven't done this today. How would you go about kind of step 1, 2, 3? And I think that each company is going to have their own requirements and the things that matter more to them. So in that sense, there isn't going to be anything that's obviously incremental for any one organization. But what I will say about it is that just because there isn't obvious information about it doesn't mean that you shouldn't try to do it. There isn't really a standardized way to link to downstream data, which I'll talk about in 1 second. But even though it represents the protocol itself, obviously the next step is how do you link that to your CRF and other clinical data, so we did implement a common data model to kind of do that gap, to bridge that gap between the protocol representation and the actual underlying data. So we used another data model that was developed by the NCI called Bridge, which USDM DDF is very similar to. It creates a unified ontology, which means that you can basically have exactly the same query across a number of different studies and therapeutic areas, and you get the same results back. But it was extremely expensive to implement, and the ROI is lower than expected, and it was also very difficult to keep synchronized. So I think that in light of that, there's probably smarter and more sophisticated ways than trying to convert the entire data set to a kind of very similar format as USDM DDF, and more than likely SDTM or something will suffice. Something like that will suffice. And finally, internal opportunities. We'd like to have better automation to handle versioning. We would like to figure out a way to standardize connecting to the data in a way that doesn't require us to do some of the more sophisticated analysis that we do today. It's not necessarily a problem though, because we now can use raw data so accurately that it's no longer as needed for answering questions correctly, but it is a thing that I think would be helpful just in general, because it's nice to be able to link it when you're looking at the protocol itself. And then maybe potentially exposing the USDM to PDF to DDF bootstrapper and protocol API externally. And that's my presentation. Thank you so much for listening. Again, I know a lot of information, very deep dive on AI topics that many people may be unaware of. So if you do have any questions about that, please do let me know. Happy to talk anytime. My name is Ellis Hiroki Butterfield, and you can contact me at any of these links. Thank you.
Thank you, Ellis, for a really great presentation. AI is a very current and relevant topic, and some of your descriptions, including things like defining hallucinations, were really helpful to understand. And you also set up the problem statement initially, which provided good context before you got to the solution. So, thank you.
Thank you.
We have now concluded the two presentations, and we're going to move on to the panel discussion. Next slide, please. So our panel today, I would like to invite all the panelists to turn their cameras on. Now we have Sylvain Robert from CRScube, Ellis from studyOS, and we have Julie from CDISC, and then myself, the moderator. So as I mentioned earlier, we've received some questions. We also got some live questions during the webinar. We will try to address as many as we can. The first question is I think quite relevant and timely. Um, in the industry, there are folks with different levels of DDF knowledge, different stages of DDF implementation. So the first question actually goes to all panelists, and maybe we start with CRScube. And the question is, for companies that have not undertaken any DDF initiatives, where would you recommend they start?
I'll take that one. I like that question. So it's interesting because I think for us, the biggest hurdle to start with was to learn about the USDM. First of all, understand actually going even before you go into the definition level, it's like what is it trying to achieve and how does it impact us as a vendor, but then even if you're a CRO or a sponsor, you need to understand how will it impact us in the future. And because we've taken the approach to implement it, we've shown our goal with it. Yeah, the first step was really to go head down, use all the documentation that's available, understand the definitions, before we could actually look at our solutions and do the mapping of, okay, so in the USDM, this is like biomedical concept. What does that mean in our EDC, for example?
Thank you, Sylvain. We'll move on to Ellis.
I think the first question an organization should answer is, what are they trying to accomplish? I think for eClinical vendors, it's a little bit more obvious. We're trying to make our processes faster and better for our clients. For sponsors or CROs who may be in the audience who may not be on the technical side, the question is, at what point in your kind of development life cycle are you, and do you have teams that can work on it internally? I think ultimately every company needs to think about it in this way. Even if you don't adopt DDF as a part of your kind of overall development, you are eventually going to be a consumer. And what that means is that at some point in time, everyone's going to be transacting protocol information using this standard. And so the question is, at what point will that become an entry point for you? Are you going to produce it, right? So if you have the kind of protocol, if you have medical writers and so on producing the protocol, how are you going to either produce this for your vendors' consumption, or how are you going to consume it so that your internal systems can be improved? But either way, I think that if you can take some of the folks on your technical team and then just review the specs, look, don't make it's not a binary decision, yes, no, today or tomorrow. It's a question of, can you just look at it? Can you get an idea of what we're offering here? What are we saying we can do? And how will this eventually play out? And so I think starting to educate yourself slowly will paint that picture in your mind, even well before you have any decisions about where you're going to go with your adoption.
Thank you, Ellis. We'll go to Julie now.
Great, thank you. I mean, great answer so far. Education is a big part of it, right? Just getting educated, your organization getting educated about what's available through DDF. There's multiple trainings available. We just announced this past week that we have a new offering, and it's a USDM onboarding package, and it's really a customized package for your organization. So getting to know your organization, what kind of challenges you're facing, and then how, DDF can actually help, being able to create a digital protocol, how you can use that downstream. But as far as what use cases to start with, I always recommend thinking about everywhere throughout your whole data flow process. So everything from, your synopsis, designing your synopsis and your study from the very beginning before you even get to a protocol, all the way through a submission. There are so many places throughout that process that people have to manually read and interpret the protocol to do something. Designing your EDC system, your electronic data transfer specifications, your CTM, like there are so many places. Even if you're exchanging data with, like real world data, trying to get that, there are just so many places. Or even from a clinical operations standpoint, there are a ton of use cases. From everything from protocol feasibility to recruitment, just so many use cases where people have to read and interpret that protocol. So look at that and figure out, okay, what are some of the biggest challenges and most expensive things we're doing by doing that reading and interpreting? And, because every stage of this, it's a different person interpreting, right? And so there are lots of quality issues because of that, and data exchange issues because of that, of how you design every step throughout that process. So figure out what are some of the biggest challenges that you are facing and where you think being able to get that protocol in a structured way might be able to help that process, and start there. A lot of companies start small with a use case that is a little bit easier to deal with. Patient recruitment is a very challenging one. I would not start there. A lot of companies do start with EDC automation because in the traditional flow, that is the next step. But, like others said, in presenting, that's a small amount of the data now. It's not nearly as much. It's probably 25 to 30% of the data that comes in, but at least it's something that this industry is very, very used to. So it's one that's a little easier to automate to start with. So that's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Julie. This next question is actually for CDISC, so you can take this one directly as well. How widely are standard templates used across industries, and are there any regulations mandating their use?
So CDISC has a lot of different standards. If you're familiar with what we do, and I say we are a whole community, not just our organization and employees. Like I said in the very beginning, CDISC standards are adopted in over 90 countries. There's so many people that contribute to it, from regulators to volunteers to members and those kind of things. Now, some standards are adopted and regulated, especially downstream, so SCTM and ADAM with the FDA and PMDA. But as far as protocol templates and standards, there are multiple things out there. Obviously, ICH M11 was mentioned earlier in the presentations. There's a version out now that everyone can take a look at. There's guidance out there on it, but no requirements. It's not mandated by any regulatory agency yet. It is more templatized. So it's, you have a template that you can use. It's not as granularly structured as what the USDM is, but USDM, the latest version 4.0, is aligned with the latest version of M11. So that is something you can adopt, but there's no regulatory requirements or anything around either of those right now. There was the TransCelerate Common Protocol template, and a lot of organizations did adopt that, and that's a first step towards digitization. And so ICH used that CPT to start working on M11, and of course that is anchored by the USDM. So in the future we think that regulators will start accepting everything, not just in M11 but even USDM. So there have been projects by regulators already to start evaluating this. Obviously, with what's going on in the U.S. right now, or from the beginning of the year, there's a lot of changes at the FDA. So those projects have slowed down. Some have been put on hold right now, but we do believe that going forward, there will be more and more look at from the regulators of USDM and obviously M11, and that they may accept protocol submissions and things like that, using these standards. Thank you.
Thank you,
I
Julie.
just
That was, go ahead,
Oh, I just wanted to add one point to that, which is just
please.
not to lose the forest for the trees, in that regardless of whether or not regulators accept or need these templates or DDF specifically, your internal processes will just be better and faster. And so just from an internal efficiencies perspective, that's really where you should start your thought process, not like whether or not some other organization will accept it. Because the reality is once you adopt something like DDF, you can always convert it back down to a format that any other regulator will accept, as opposed to the other way around, which would be transforming to DDF, which is always more challenging and expensive.
Yeah, thank you so much for saying that, Ellis. Actually, I want to say that about all the standards that we produce, right? A lot of companies do not adopt until it is regulated, right? The regulators put out something that this is going to be required, and they give that period of, you have this long to adopt. That's kind of the carrot versus the stick, right? That's kind of a stick. We really want to show, and with our initiative that we're really focused on this year and over the next few years, and even probably the way we produce standards going forward, is that we want to show the value of the standards, right? And that's why we're adding things like the semantic layer with biomedical concepts and digitalization from the beginning with USDM, is we want to show that these things actually can improve the way you do business, right? It can improve your overall efficiency, it can reduce your timelines, it can reduce costs. And so with our 360i initiative that we're working on right now, we are trying to demonstrate all that, right? So we're trying to show the end-to-end automation. And our phase one is focused on from digital protocol through SCTM, but then we're also in the meantime working on analysis concepts to break those things down further, like your endpoints, objectives, your eligibility criteria, to break those down even further with analysis concepts, very much like the biomedical concepts, to be able to even then go in phase two through your analysis. So we really do want to show that the value of the standards, not just that it's a stick and you have to submit them in these regions. So again, thank you for saying that.
Yeah, thank you, Julie. That was well-rounded and quite descriptive for us to understand. And thank you, Ellis, for chiming in. This next question is actually for you, Ellis, studyOS. Any specific advantages of AI apps for document production?
Any specific? uh, I mean, I guess it really depends on the document and what you're trying to produce. Bit of a high level question there. So I'll say this, not because so studyOS does not produce documents as our product. Just to be clear, we allow you to interrogate data and put controls on study data in the same way that you would do for kind of risk monitoring or data review. But despite that, we're obviously very familiar with the space. In fact, I would say that the reason it's called generative AI is very much because it's good at producing textual content. So if anything, it's probably the most structurally aligned with that specific use case. I think that if you're going to be using generative AI for document production internally, one thing I would consider or think about is that there's a very big difference between e-clinical vendors and again, even within e-clinical vendors, there's a spectrum of their proficiency and the kind of capabilities in them. So at the furthest end of the spectrum, if you take general purpose AI tools and then you expect them to generate content for you, you are going to set yourself up for what I would consider failure, but not in a way that you might expect. It's very easy for these general purpose systems to come up with random content, hallucinate, and not be tied to your underlying, SOPs and everything else like that. And so, in that sense, you can use them, but you just have to be extremely cautious with them and have a much more scrutiny about that. And even then, your privacy policies on your organizations may prevent you from doing that. If you go with clinical vendors who obviously understand a bit more about what they're talking about, they understand your use cases, they understand your requirements, then they're more likely to be able to incorporate relevant organizational and protocol specific information when doing these kind of document generation processes. And there's a lot more trust you can put into those processes. And then finally, on the further end, if you are an organization that can internally develop and you have access to engineers who can build an entire kind of retrieval augmented generation pipeline and can put quality checks and do eval systems and everything else like that. All of those are technical terms that they'll understand. But the point is, if you can put all of that in place, then yeah, it's an amazing use case for you, and it should very much speed up your work. In fact, I believe that at the last Scope conference, I don't remember who was talking about it, but they were talking about how they used it for their CSR development. So I think that there's quite a lot that can be done there, and it's a place I would definitely invest in if I could as an organization.
Thank you, Ellis. That was helpful. This next question is for CRScube, and it actually came in live during the webinar. Do you find missing BCs when working on this pipeline? How do you deal with it?
So that's a good question, and yes. So at first, our expectation, I think, was that everything, all the items we have in our forms would end up being defined BCs, but they're not. But we've been using the biomedical surrogate to match like those CRF items that don't necessarily have biomedical concepts defined yet for them. So this has been our workaround, and it works well. And I think so far, from what we see, that's all we need to carry on working on implementing the biomedical concepts into CubeDDF and into our configuration tool.
Okay. Thank you, Sylvain.
And Govind, I can add to that a little bit as well if you
Please,
would like.
please.
I would like to put in a plug because this is a challenge, right? The development of biomedical concepts, it's challenging, and there are so many that we could create. And so putting in a plug, we love to have volunteers to help with this. And we also just issued an AI innovation challenge from CDISC. We had the webinar on the 1st of July. And one of the use cases for that is to be able to develop biomedical concepts using AI. So being able to take in lots of different documents, the different standards, therapeutic area user guides, things like that, or even your data sets if you have those, and being able to develop biomedical concepts or extract biomedical concepts out of all these documents so we can develop faster. So we do want, like all of the standards, it to be community driven. Obviously, it will go through a governance process and things like that, and we'll have to get the C codes, tied to all the different concepts. But just want to put that plug in that we would love more community involvement in that. And of course, there's the AI Innovation Challenge that you can be a part of as well, and that's one of the use cases. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Julie, for sharing that message, and thank you, Sylvain, as well. This next question is for CRScube and studyOS. We'll start with CRScube. How can we prepare modular protocols that will be easy for sites to understand? Should we use AI to summarize individual studies that are part of an umbrella study and use didactic visuals that are specific to the sub-study?
So I don't think I'm going to be able to give much of an insight here because, as you've seen, we don't directly deal with the digitization of protocols at our end. We're going to ingest the JSONs coming from other systems. So we haven't really looked into that.
No problem. Thank you. And we'll go to Ellis.
Well, trying to understand the question a little bit more, so give me 1 second. I think that similar to Sylvain, it's not something that we specialize in particular. I think that if you happen to have DDF, if you happen to have all of your study protocols in DDF format, then it would be easier for you to reference very specific portions of those protocols and pull out what you need in order to create these different sub-study information. And So in that sense, if everything were in DDF format for you, you would have an easier time doing that than going through the PDFs or the Word documents and trying to pull out the relevant information. That being said, as far as creating visuals, I don't know if AI is necessarily good for that, and probably not a relevant use case. Would be my initial take on the question. But if there's more information on here, again, happy to answer anything over email with more information, is if that's something that I can contribute back to the community.
Thanks, Alice. Here's a question that actually came in for StudyOS Live. Can StudyOS directly convert protocols from doc format to USDM format?
Yeah, if you're talking about using, Microsoft Word or something like that, it's no different than if it were in a PDF, really. So the answer is yes. It's not something we offer externally as a product right now. I do believe, I don't want to accidentally promote the wrong vendor here, but there is a vendor, I believe, who showed up on one of the prior USDM DDF solutions calls like this, who does actually do that as a core offering. And so you may want to contact some of the TransCelerate folks and find out who that might have been, or refer to the past presentations and go to that company. I believe that they could do that.
Thanks, Alice. We're close to time. Maybe we just take one more quick question. This was also a live question that came in for CRScube. And then maybe we go to a close after that, since we only have a few minutes left. How are you linking forms to USDM/C-?
So for that, for us it's the biomedical concepts, because USDM has biomedical concepts, and then the forms have the biomedical concept equivalent as well. So that's how we do the link between our forms, USDM/C-.
Awesome. Thank you, Sylvain. Go ahead. Was someone going to add something to that? Okay. I think we've come towards the end of the panel discussion and the webinar itself. On the screen, you can see some useful resources if you're curious about DDF, USDM, TransCelerate. In about a week or so, this will be published, the slides, and you can refer to and click on those links. Please look out for that. But I just want to mainly thank all the panelists who went through a lot of preparation for this in the last weeks, couple of months. Thank you so much. Thanks for joining the panel discussion and taking the questions. Really appreciate it. We also want to thank TransCelerate organizers, CDISC organizers, and also most importantly the participants who joined today. So thank you all very much. We'll go for a close, and then we'll meet you all again in the next webinar.